Today's video is brought to you by Wondrium. Look, you've clicked on an educational video on YouTube. I'm willing to bet you like educational videos, and for that reason, I think you'll love Wondrium. Look, I like learning new things. It's a shocker, I know, and Wondrium is an amazing place for doing that. Wondrium was previously known as the Great Courses Plus, a long-time sponsor of this channel, which always had an amazing selection of traditional academic takes on a wide range of subject matter. They had everything from maths to literature to chess. Wondrium is the next generation of the Great Courses Plus. It has all the amazing lectures and courses that the Great Courses had, plus it's got an amazing new selection of documentaries, how-to videos, tutorials, and other long and short form videos. Wondrium has amazing courses from some of the world's top professors, and you can stream them pretty much everywhere. Big screen at home or mobile phone on the move, it's all covered. As for a recommendation, I enjoyed Examining the Big Questions of Time, which is a series that looks at a bunch of different elements related to the big concept of time itself in a lot of different ways. It's something you think you might know a lot about, something that, just seems fundamental and basic, and it is very, very much not. I was amazed at what I didn't know about time, and definitely mind-expanding stuff for sure. Look, if you've ever wondered about anything, Wondrium will be your new favorite place. And they're giving viewers a great offer of a free trial. Show your support for this show by subscribing to Wondrium now. Go to wondrium.com/brainfood. There's also a link below. And now today's video. The first films were little more than what we would consider short clips. A boxer throwing a single punch or a train arriving at the station. The type of scenes that today you might only see in the form of animated GIFs. While popular perception is that movies got their start around the early 20th century, the real seed that grew into the film industry came a few decades before that in a fascinating murderer by the name of Edward Muybridge's truly revolutionary 1878 Horse in Motion. While this and hundreds of subsequent similar works, the rather colourful Muybridge filmed wowed audiences the world over, this first film was not created to entertain, but to answer a question that seems a bit ridiculous to us today, but baffled for centuries artists, horse enthusiasts, and scientists alike. So, what was the question? Do all four of a horse's hooves leave the ground in mid-gallop? While again, this might seem incredibly silly, if you look at artists' depictions of horses galloping throughout history up to Muybridge's Horse in Motion, they almost universally depict the horse in galloping correctly. The problem, of course, was that this question could not be answered by the naked eye. And leading up to the momentous Horse in Motion, photographic technology of the day wasn't up to the task of clearly capturing a horse galloping. Enter Leland Stanford of Stanford University fame, who wanted to answer this question and in the process learn as much as possible about how horses run in order to potentially improve the performance of his race horses. For a little background on the man, while today many of us have only heard of Stanford because of the university he helped found in homage to his son who died at 16, by today's standards Leland Stanford was somewhat corrupt. He initially made his fortune by selling mining equipment to those who came west for the California gold rush. He then invested a significant portion of this money into the California Central Pacific Railroad, becoming one of the big four to financially spur the success of the iconic railway. At the same time, and perhaps because of it, he was elected California's governor. Using the office to enrich himself and his fellow investors further, he secured massive state investment and land grants for the railroad project. He became ludicrously wealthy, at his peak having a net worth of about $1.5 billion in today's dollars. He owned several mansions, vineyards, and a racetrack in Palo Alto. Speaking of this racetrack, after the completion of the railroad, horses became Stanford's obsession. According to George T. Clarke's biography, Leland Stanford, it was actually Stanford's doctor's orders that he take on supposedly stress-free hobbies like horse rearing and racing. Because he apparently couldn't do anything half-speed, Stanford wanted to revolutionize how horse trainers worked with race horses. In order to do this, he realized that he needed to figure out how horses ran, in the process answering the age-old question. So, he turned to the best and most innovative photographer in San Francisco, Edward Muybridge, who, as we'll be getting to, led a rather interesting life, including good old-fashioned murdering someone in cold blood and getting off, which was a rather momentous ruling for the future of filmmaking. Born in England in 1830, Muybridge moved to the United States and became a bookseller around 1852. Ultimately ending up in California, he was moderately successful at this venture, and by the age of 30, he decided he was ready for something else. He announced in the paper in 1860, "I have this day sold to my brother Thomas S. Muybridge my entire stock of books, engravings, etc. I shall leave for New York, London, Berlin, Paris, Rome, and Vienna, etc." However, on his way to start his grand adventure, a fateful stagecoach crash in Texas resulted in Muybridge being ejected from the coach, at which point he smacked his head against a rock, causing severe brain trauma. And let that be a lesson to your kids: never leave home because it's dangerous outside. In any event, when he awoke in hospital some 150 miles away, he noted that each eye formed an individual impression, so that looking at you, for instance, I could see another man sitting by your side. After several months, he recovered enough to return to England, but apparently, having learned his lesson about adventuring, did not go on the grand tour that he'd previously planned, instead spending the next 6 years in his native land. While the accident may have left him with permanent brain damage, it also set the stage for the career that would make him world famous. You see, at some point during his lengthy recovery period, according to Muybridge, one of his physicians, no doubt playing a hilarious joke on this individual who had vision problems, suggested he take up the relatively new field of photography. Fast forward to 1872, and Muybridge was one of the leading photographers in the world, being vaulted to that worldwide fame after shooting over 200 stunningly clear shots of Yosemite Valley in 1868. It's an easy thing to do today, but in his time it was an amazing achievement. Beyond being exceptionally difficult to capture such shots with any clarity due to long exposure times, this also required him to trek around the wilderness for several months, carrying all the equipment that he'd need to both take and develop the photos on the spot. Once a location was chosen, he'd then have to wait for just the right lighting and weather conditions that would allow him to take the expansive shots without blurring. Wanting the best, as previously noted, Stanford approached Muybridge about helping him figure out how exactly a horse runs. Despite Stanford's suggestion that they could do this by combining multiple real-time photos in succession, Muybridge declared the task impossible. The available technology of the day wouldn't allow it. Exposure times were typically on the order of 15 to 60 seconds, which was completely unsuitable for capturing any motion whatsoever. Money talks, however, and Stanford was ultimately able to convince Muybridge to take on the project via offering him what ended up being more or less an open-ended budget. While the pair made significant progress on this front over the next 2 years, including managing to capture a very blurry image that seemed to show a horse galloping with all 4 legs in the air, in 1874 the project was interrupted because Muybridge was arrested for murder, a crime that he happily confessed to. You see, 2 years earlier he'd married the 21-year-old and 20 years his junior Flora Stone. When he originally met Stone, she was already married, with Muybridge paying for her divorce. Back in 1874, on April the 15th of that year, she bore a son, Florido Helios Muybridge. Not long after the birth of the child, Muybridge went to pay the midwife who delivered the boy, Susan Smith. While there, Muybridge discovered a photograph of his son. On the back it said, "Little Harry," in his wife's handwriting. When Muybridge saw this, he went ballistic. Under extreme duress, the midwife confessed to Muybridge that Flora and one Major Harry Larkins were having an affair. The midwife later recounted what happened next. When I told Muybridge of the affair, he cried like a baby. He then asked her, "Whose baby is that? Mine or Larkins?" She replied, "I do not know." She then told him she had seen his wife on the bed with her clothes down to her waist, and Larkin sat on the bedside. Muybridge did not take the news well. Quote, "In great agony of mind, he wandered about. My opinion is when he left me, he was insane." End quote. Directly after leaving the midwife, Muybridge went home and collected his revolver. He then took a train and a horse and carriage to Larkin's home. Several hours after learning of the affair, Muybridge knocked on the door. According to February 4th, 1875 edition of the San Francisco Chronicle, when Larkins answered the door, Muybridge said, "I am Muybridge, and this is a message from my wife." At which point he pulled out the gun and shot Larkins in the chest, killing him. Muybridge was subsequently arrested, and a few months later he was put on trial for murder. At no point did he deny killing Larkins, nor did he himself claim that he had been driven insane when he killed him. Quite the contrary, in fact, he felt he was justified in the act. In an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle while in prison, Muybridge described his relationships and motivations. He said, "We never had any trouble to speak of. We sometimes had little disputes about money matters, but they were not serious. I was always a man of very simple tastes and few wants, and I did not spend much money. What I had left over after paying my little expenses, I gave to her. But she was always wanting more. I could never see that she had bought anything with it to speak of, or imagine what she did with it. We sometimes had little spats about money, but nothing serious. I loved the woman with all my heart and soul, and the revelation of her infidelity was a cruel, frustrating blow to me. Since the shooting, I've been told many things to which I was previously blind. Friends whom I should have expected to inform me when they saw how I was being deceived have now told me all. I did not desire to see her again. They may ransack my records as much as they please, and I defy them to bring anything against me. I have no fear of the results. I feel that I was justified in what I did, and that all right-minded people would justify my action. Of course, though, the law is the law, and this sort of vigilantism tends to not hold up well when placed in the crucible of organized justice. Luckily for Muybridge, the enormously wealthy and influential Leland Stanford still wanted his question answered, and he needed Muybridge to do it. Thus, Stanford hired a team of lawyers to defend him, including C.H. King and W.W. Pendergast. They outlined their defense in their opening remarks on February 3, 1875. "We claim a verdict both on the ground of justifiable homicide and insanity. We shall prove that years ago the prisoner was thrown from a stage, receiving a concussion of the brain which turned his hair from black to grey in 3 days, and has never been the same since." Ultimately, the jury was not convinced that Muybridge had been insane, not the least of which because, as previously noted in public comments, he didn't seem inclined towards the notion, though he never testified officially in the case. However, while the judge explicitly told the jury that killing a man for having an affair with one's wife was by no means justifiable murder as far as the law was concerned, the jury didn't agree. As noted in a contemporary report in the San Francisco Chronicle, the jury discarded entirely the theory of insanity and, meeting the case on the bare issue left, acquitted the defendant on the grounds that he was justified in killing Larkins for seducing his wife. This was directly contrary to the charge of the judge, but the jury did not mince the matter or attempt to excuse the verdict. They say that if their verdict was not in accord with the law of the books, it is with the law of human nature that, in short, under similar circumstances, they would have done as Muybridge did, and they could not conscientiously punish him for doing what they would have done themselves. On this note, for those unaware, jury nullification in the United States is a little talked about thing in which, contrary to what judges will often imply when instructing jury members, the jury is fully within their rights to throw out the law completely and ignore literally anything the court tells them and simply rule how they wish based on their own feelings and thoughts about something. Jury nullification has been used in America during different periods as a means for citizens to defy unpopular laws such as the 19th century's Alien and Sedition Acts and the fugitive slave laws. In fact, throughout the 20th century, American juries have continued to nullify what otherwise would have been criminal convictions, including when 3 different juries acquitted Dr. Death, Jack Kevorkian, of charges of assisted suicide in the 1990s, though he would later serve prison time as he continued to help those who wished to end their existence. Today, American jury nullification remains alive and well, with a relatively recent example being when Rastafarian Doug Darrell, who grew pot in his backyard, was acquitted by a jury of his peers. One of the jurors summed up their decision as, "I knew that my community would be poorer rather than better off had he been convicted." Going back to Muybridge, in the aftermath of the murder, Muybridge's wife would divorce him, but she became ill and died about 9 months after Muybridge killed her lover. As for Florado, with his mother no longer alive to care for him and his supposed father dead at the hands of Muybridge, Muybridge unceremoniously put the poor boy in an orphanage, though he did provide for his financial needs. It was later noted that the child grew up to slightly resemble Muybridge, perhaps indicating that he had indeed been his son and not Harry Larkins, as Muybridge and his wife had thought. Florado himself seems to have been inclined towards the notion, as when he died at the age of 70 after being hit by a car, his tombstone stated, "Florado Helios Muybridge, April 16, 1874 to February 2, 1944, son of photographer Edward James Muybridge." Whatever the case, as for Muybridge, he travelled throughout South America for about a year before returning in 1876 to begin working with Stanford again. With Stanford's ample resources in hand, the project ultimately costing about $50,000 or $1.14 million today, Muybridge invented a new rapid shutter mechanism and more sensitive chemicals, allowing for quick, clear exposure of a galloping horse. And so it was that after many failed experiments and ultimately some successful test runs that revealed the answer clearly, on June 19, 1878, Muybridge and Stanford invited the press to watch them officially capture something that would change the way we looked at the world. On one side of the track was a white shed filled with a dozen cameras, each containing 2 lenses to make 2 separate exposures per camera, in case one didn't come out right. On the other side was a white background to increase contrast. On the track itself were a series of 12 tripwires, spaced approximately 20 to 21 inches apart, with each connected to the camera's shutter mechanism. Press surrounded the track. At the far end, master trainer Charles Marvin had the reins of one of Stanford's racehorses. With a gun blast, the horse took off. In less than half a second after she'd reached the first tripwire, the horse had tripped all 12 of them, setting up a succession of dropping shutters. Time at this point was critical, as the shots just taken had to be processed while the negatives were still moist, with only around 10 to 20 minutes to develop the 24 plates after taking the shots. Once Muybridge had done this in his little mobile development studio, he put the pictures out for the gathered people to see. It should be noted here that beyond the necessity to develop the shots right away, it was particularly critical for the press to see him do this. You see, some past test photos Muybridge had captured of a horse in full gallop had been largely dismissed by many in the press as forgeries, with some even going so far as to mock his supposed shots in cartoon caricatures. Many people simply refused to believe that it was actually possible to take a clear photo of a galloping horse. Thus, Muybridge wanted the journalists to see the horse galloping live and see him both take the shots of it and develop the photos in front of them so there would be no doubt of their accuracy and his accomplishment. As for the pictures themselves, they were stunningly clear, with one witness to the event noting that you could even see the thread-like tip of Mr. Marvin's whip in each negative. Ultimately, rough wood cuttings were made so that the photos could be transferred into newspapers for the public to see, with the following result. What was revealed in the succession of photos is that yes, horses did basically fly through the air when galloping, as at one point all 4 of their hooves did leave the ground. What's more, this happened when their hooves were pointed inward, as opposed to outward like most speculated, and what the majority of artists up to this point had portrayed when showing horses galloping. Some famed artists of the day took the news well, even subsequently contacting Muybridge to help them make their future works look more accurate. However, as was noted in the press, Muybridge's photo seemingly made a mockery of pretty much all past artworks depicting horses moving. So it's perhaps no surprise that some artists such as famed sculptor Auguste Rodin, best known today for his The Thinker sculpture, went the other way, noting, "It is the artist who is truthful and it is the photography which lies, for in reality, time does not stop." Needless to say, Muybridge and Stanford's stunt was a rousing success, but this was just the beginning. Muybridge now had a way to film things in natural motion. He quickly improved the technology, including inventing an electromagnetic timer to control the shutters instead of tripwires, allowing for a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. Beyond this, he invented what was more or less the first movie projector in his Zoopraxioscope, showing the first film, The Horse in Motion, in the fall of 1879 to Stanford and a select group. As one reporter noted of the first movie screening, nothing was wanting but the clatter of hooves upon the turf and the occasional breath of steam to make the spectator believe he had before him the flesh and blood steeds. There was a problem in all this, though. Initially, Stanford and Muybridge seemed the best of friends and happy to credit the other for their respective contributions to this revolution of art and science. Stanford provided the funds, focus, and staff, and Muybridge did the inventing and capturing of the historic images. The mutual credit would all change, however, with the publishing of a book by one of Stanford's friends, Dr. J.B.D. Stillman, titled The Horse in Motion in 1882. In it, the rather aptly named Stillman would show around 100 drawings copied from Muybridge's photos, but without crediting Muybridge. In fact, Muybridge was only mentioned in passing in the book as an employee of Stanford's. This was despite the fact that the book was explicitly executed and published under the auspices of Leland Stanford, who knew well Muybridge's real contributions. Beyond being offended at credit not being given, this also cost Muybridge a prestigious job and a fair amount of reputation, at least initially in his homeland. After witnessing several such films Muybridge had subsequently made in a lecture he gave in Britain, the British Royal Society of Arts offered him a rather lucrative contract to film other animals and people in motion for academic study. But when the book came out with no real mention of Muybridge, the Royal Society retracted their offer, thinking Muybridge was lying about his contributions in the project. Not only that, but they also accused him of being a plagiarist. An academic paper Muybridge was attempting to get published on the motion of horses mirrored on several points what was written in Stillman's book, but with no credit given to Stillman. Of course, the fact was that the work by Muybridge had formed the basis for Dr. Stillman's notes in the book, not the other way around, as the Royal Society now assumed. Muybridge was devastated, lamenting, "The doors of the Royal Society were thus closed against me, and my promising career in London was brought to a disastrous close." Muybridge would go on to not only sue the publisher of the book, but Stanford himself, thinking Stanford was intentionally trying to downplay Muybridge's contributions and take all of the credit himself, as so many who financed inventors have done before. Ultimately, Muybridge lost the lawsuits, but by this time the University of Pennsylvania, who did not doubt Muybridge's work, offered to fund him in filming everything from birds in flight to nude men and women doing various things like carrying buckets, going up and down stairs, hitting baseballs, rowing boats, dancing, etc. The point of all this, at least as far as the university was concerned, was to study various complex body movements in slow motion. As for Muybridge, while he publicly lauded the scientific merit of his work, he more reveled in the art of it all and rightly recognized how his work would influence its artists to come. Beyond the more obvious examples, with several famed paintings in the subsequent decades just putting their own spin on one of Muybridge's stills, his books could be found on the desks of many of the early animators in Hollywood as they tried to accurately depict motion. On top of this, Muybridge's idea of what is now sometimes called bullet time has been popular throughout the history of cinema, perhaps best depicted today in the original Matrix film. Long before the film, and many others before and since used the exact technique, however, Muybridge was first setting up a series of cameras in a semicircle around subjects, trying to take pictures as they moved. In one such case, a nude Muybridge can be seen swinging a pickaxe. In the end, Muybridge, who viewed himself as an artist rather than a scientist, ultimately made his money using his new technology to aid science while hoping to influence art. That said, he saw great room for advancements in this field beyond, describing the future of what would become cinema. Quote, "In the not-too-distant future, instruments will be constructed that will not only reproduce visible actions simultaneously with audible words, but an entire opera with the gestures, facial expressions, and songs of the performers, with all the accompanying music, will be recorded and reproduced by an apparatus combining the principles of the zoopraxioscope and the phonograph for the instruction and entertainment of an audience long after the original participants have passed away." Despite his life's work being largely in the public eye, beyond initially having his accomplishments somewhat usurped by Stanford and Stillman, Muybridge's role as one of the fathers of film would be largely forgotten by popular history. To add insult to injury, after he died in 1904, even his own tombstone had his name misspelled. So moving on from here in the world of cinema, Thomas Edison visited Muybridge's studios sometime in the mid-1880s. Taking a keen interest in Muybridge's groundbreaking work, but unimpressed by his execution, Edison began to develop a device that would do for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. Around 1889, the kinetograph debuted out of Edison's West Orange lab. Despite Edison's claims that he was the one who invented what many hail as the first camera to photograph motion pictures, historians generally attribute Edison's assistant, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, as the creator of the history-making invention. In 1890, Dixon shot a test movie entitled Monkey Shines No. 1, featuring movements of another lab assistant, with the result being like something a ghost hunter would use as proof that evil spirits are lurking, rather than like the films that would soon start to come out. Nevertheless, it's generally given credit for being the first official video camera motion picture in history. It also inspired Edison to build what was perhaps the first movie studio near his West Orange lab. Calling it Black Maria because he thought it resembled a police wagon, this is where they shot hundreds of motion pictures featuring vaudeville, magic shows, boxing matches, and Wild West stunts. Included among the latter is a video of Annie Oakley showing off her prodigious skills with a rifle. From here, motion picture innovation took off. In April 1894, the Kinetoscope Parlor opened in New York City, essentially the first public movie theater. Then there was the first movie projected for a wide audience, the first on-screen kiss, and the first theater permanently created entirely for a film. In 1895, the Lumiere brothers, who made several groundbreaking advancements of their own in film and video camera design, became the first real film auteurs, making and exhibiting films with short narratives, including the famed 50-second short Arrivée d'un train en la gare La Ciotat. They also debuted the first comedy film featuring a gardener and his waterhouse. With their revolutionary technology, the Lumiere brothers began attracting audiences from far and wide, including shoemaker-turned-illusionist Georges Méliès, who attended one of their screenings in late 1895. Méliès was born in Paris in 1861 to a shoemaker who fully expected his sons to follow in his footsteps when he retired. Despite showing an interest in stage performance at an early age, his father refused to support him in this career, and after attending school, Méliès dutifully settled into a career as a shoemaker. Soon, though, his father did retire and handed off the business to his three sons, including Georges. Georges still wanted nothing to do with it and promptly sold his share of the shoe business to his brothers, using the money, along with a sizable dowry from his wife, to purchase an old run-down downtown theatre called the Robert Houdin Theatre. Méliès turned the theatre into a popular magic show venue, but he was always looking for an edge, and upon seeing the Lumiere brothers' demonstration of their magical device that showed motion pictures, he attempted to buy it from them. The Lumieres refused, so Méliès built his own video camera with the help of an engineer. Filming his illusions and playing them back to the audience proved to be a big hit. He soon took his camera outside, filming street scenes and creating narratives. It was supposedly in the autumn of 1896 when Méliès discovered a significant trick the camera could play when it jammed up while filming. In his own words, "During this minute, the passers-by, buses, carriages, had moved, of course. When I projected the film, joined at the place where the break had occurred, I suddenly saw a Madeleine Bastille bus changed into a hearse, and the men changed into women. The substitution trick, called stop motion, had been discovered." The simple special effect became the basis of the film The Haunted Castle. This film begins with a bat flying into a castle, then magically turning into a caped demon figure known as Mephistopheles. It ends with Mephistopheles being chased out by someone holding a crucifix. And okay, The Shining or Exorcist it is not, but this 1896 film, directed by legendary film visionary Georges Méliès, is generally considered the first horror movie ever created, featuring a boiling cauldron, a tiny minion, phantoms, a skeleton, apparent suicide from one of the terrified characters, and even a witch. It certainly hits a few of the tropes that we are accustomed to seeing in today's scary movies. The film's, for the time, state-of-the-art special effects also adds thrills, and all of these screams are delivered in a runtime of just under 3 minutes. While it's thought of today as the first horror movie, Méliès meant the film to be more surprising and attention-grabbing than anything else. The premise is pretty nonsensical, obviously intended to showcase stunning for the 19th century special effects rather than any particularly compelling story. As you can see if you go watch it, throughout the nearly 3 minutes, images keep popping up, disappearing, and turning into other things. A bat turns into a demon, girls turn into witches, a bench suddenly has a skeleton, and the thin air turns into a trident-wielding goblin. Going back to the aforementioned ending of a crucifix being used to chase the demon character out, because of this ending and the general garb of the evil protagonist, not to mention his ability to turn into a bat, is sometimes described as the first vampire movie. Notably, Bram Stoker's Dracula would not be released until the next year. Also of note, one of the women in the film is Jehane d'Alcy, who would later become Méliès's mistress and later his second wife. The Haunted Castle is not Georges Méliès's finest film, however, it's just an early effort. His most lauded work is generally considered to be A Trip to the Moon, a masterpiece that is the direct ancestor of every science fiction ever made. Its fantastical narrative about going to the moon, including that iconic image of the moon with a rocket stuck in its eye, has inspired filmmakers ever since. In all, Méliès astonishingly made around 500 films in just 14 years, or on average about one every 10 days. Unfortunately, only about 200 of them have survived since. While many are more highly regarded than 1896's Le Manoir du Diable, none but that can stake the claim as being the first horror movie ever. As for Méliès himself, a series of missteps and inability to adapt to new film sales models in World War I would ultimately see the once extremely prosperous filmmaker impoverished and working in a little toy/candy booth in Montparnasse train station in Paris. If this all sounds familiar, perhaps you've seen the film Hugo, which is based on the book The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which in turn is loosely based on the life of Georges Méliès. Bonus fact. Speaking of horror movies and early films featuring a whole lot of nudity as people used them to study the human form in motion, this might have you wondering who invented the movie rating system. To begin with, in March of 1897, James Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons boxed one another in Carson City, Nevada. It was watched live by thousands of fans, but it was soon going to be seen by many more. Enco Rector had used over 11,000 feet of film to capture the spectacle, and 2 months later, the film premiered in New York with a runtime of over 100 minutes. The Corbett-Fitzsimmons fight is often credited as being the first feature film. It would eventually be shown in 10 different cities over an 11-month period. At the time, prize fighting was illegal in every state in the US beside Nevada, but it wasn't necessarily illegal to show prize fighting, hence the popularity of the film. In response to this new technology circumventing the rules, 7 states, including New York, all passed a law fining those who showed the film. While in most cases it was shown anyway, this was one of the first instances of governing bodies attempting to regulate what people watched on film. 10 years later, Chicago became the first city to regulate and censor movies in general, with over 115 Nickelodeons across the city, and the Chicago Tribune announcing that they had an influence that is wholly vicious. Censorship rules were enacted in 1907. The city council gave the chief of police the power to issue or not issue permits for the exhibition of moving pictures. If a movie didn't meet his standards or someone he delegated the task to, a permit would be denied. The United States Supreme Court ultimately upheld Chicago's right to do this. Additionally, Chicago created a separate pink permit to mark those movies that were adult only. This, however, backfired when the pink permits acted as more of advertisements rather than deterrents. In 1909, New York City, by order of Mayor George B. McClellan, closed 550 theaters because the police chief claimed that most movie material was reprehensible. In response to this, the National Board of Censorship was formed as the first formal attempt by the film industry to ward off legal film censorship through quasi-self-regulation. For a small fee, the board would recommend cuts. Fast-forwarding a few years later, and Mutual Film Corporation was a newsreel company that was getting annoyed by the fees and slow turnaround time on what they could show and couldn't show. They insisted the film should be protected under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and should not be subject to censorship. The Supreme Court disagreed. In Mutual and Ohio Industrial Commission, Chief Justice Edward White wrote, "The exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit, like other spectacles, and not to be regarded as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion within the meaning of freedom of speech and publication." This brings us to 1922, when the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA, was formed. They hired Postmaster General and head of the Republican National Committee, William Hayes, with his job, among other things, being to lobby Washington on behalf of the movie industry. Pertinent to the topic at hand, he also helped form a list of commonly rejected themes, subjects, occurrences that he asked movie studios to heed, called the Don't and Be Careful list. Some of the don'ts included the illegal traffic of drugs, white slavery, and ridicule of the clergy. The Be Careful, in that good taste may be emphasized list, included methods of smuggling, the use of the American flag, and men and women in bed together. In 1930, the MPPDA set up the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code. It didn't wield any real power until it joined forces with the Legion of Decency, an organization created by the Catholic Church as well as other religious organizations dedicated to combating objectionable material. From that point forwards, the MPPDA would only approve films that had the Catholic Church's seal of approval. The Legion of Decency would also assign ratings to the approved films. For instance, the original 1947 Miracle on 34th Street was given the dreaded B rating by the Catholic Legion due to their mother in the film being divorced. If you're not familiar, a B rating announced that the Legion found it morally objectionable in part. Later, the B and C, condemned by the Legion of Decency, were merged to be one rating, O for morally offensive. However, a few notable cases threaten the status quo. The MPPDA, which would soon be renamed the MPAA, Motion Picture Association of America, would not approve Howard Hughes' film The Outlaw because it was deemed that there were too many shots that emphasized Jane Russell's bosom. Hughes was insistent that the film and Russell's chest needed to be seen, so in 1946, 5 years after the film was shot, he signed a distribution deal with a non-MPAA signatory, United Artists, a studio originally founded by actors Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks. This began to erode the MPAA's power. Further, the Hollywood antitrust case of 1948 declared it was illegal for studios to own the theaters as well, prying the door open even further for exhibitors to pick and choose what movies they wanted to show, no matter if they had the MPAA's approval or not. Next, in 1952, the Supreme Court reversed their 1915 decision by saying that expression by means of motion pictures is included within the free speech and free press guarantee of the First Amendment. That, combined with a series of films, 1955's Man with the Golden Arm, 1956's Baby Doll, and the 1960 British film Blow Up, that openly defied the MPAA's censorship ruling, yet were exhibited and did quite well financially, setting the stage for a complete overhaul of the MPAA's system of monitoring. Jack Valenti worked for President Lyndon B. Johnson in the White House as a special assistant to the press before he became the president of the MPAA in 1968. Thanks to his experience and proximity to one of the greatest negotiators of the age, Valenti knew how to work with groups to reach a compromise. In 1968, he introduced a voluntary movie rating system because, as Valenti put it, the Hays Code had the odious smell of censorship. From 1968 to 1970, the ratings were G, general audiences, M for mature audiences, R, restricted, under 17 if accompanied by an adult, and X, not admitted if under 17. In 1970, M was changed to PG, parental guidance, due to the confusing nature of the term mature audiences. As for the X rating, as you might have noticed, it wasn't synonymous with pornography in the beginning. This didn't happen until the 1970s. The MPAA never trademarked the X rating, unlike the other ratings, and it was hijacked by the pornography industry as a means to hype up their material, often adding several X's to imply that the film was much more risque and obscene than others. In fact, several mainstream and well-regarded movies were given X ratings when first released before it became strongly associated with pornography, including A Clockwork Orange, The Evil Dead, and Midnight Cowboy. In 1990, this pornography association ultimately gave rise to the MPAA abandoning the X rating in favor of a new NC-17 rating for films where those under 17 were not to be admitted. 6 years later, this was changed to anyone 17 and under, making 18 the new age requirement for these films. As for PG-13, it was Steven Spielberg who helped usher in that rating. When Jaws was released in 1977, it was rated PG, despite the violence being deemed too much for young kids, but of course not deemed enough that it needed an R rating. In 1984, he directed Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and was the executive producer on Gremlins, both of which received a PG rating, which, granted, stood for parental guidance, but if a parent hadn't seen the movie first, it was difficult for them to tell much based solely on the rating. Thus, Spielberg and many others felt the PG rating was too broad and suggested a PG-14 rating. The next year, the MPAA, taking Spielberg's suggestion, instituted the PG-13 rating, with Red Dawn the first film with that rating. And the rest, as they say, is history.